So today we got Peter Berthelsen. You just coached me through that and I messed it up. Peter, you want to explain who you are, what you do?
Yeah, my name's Pete Berthelsen, and at its core, I'm just a wildlife biologist, Mike. That's all I am. But I've spent my career designing, establishing, and managing highly diverse habitat and things that look an awful lot like pollinator habitat. So I've really kind of, throughout the course of my career, my maturation as a wildlife biologist, before we called things pollinator habitat, that's what I was doing, and that's really kind of where I hang my hat now. Is the expertise of kind of trying to help people prepare for success in establishing great pollinator habitat, whether it's on a solar energy project or in somebody's backyard.
So, wildlife biologist, I mean, what does that cover? I mean, when I hear wildlife biologist, I think animals as well as the
Mhm.
habitat.
Yeah, well, so wildlife biologist in my case means everything from, well, let me back up and say I didn't go to school to learn how to handle HR, hiring people, administering budgets, and all of those kinds of things. But that's what wildlife biologist has grown into. I spent a significant chunk of my career, 27 years, working with a nonprofit wildlife conservation group. And then in 2017, decided, I'm really, really passionate about this pollinator habitat and health issue. And so left that organization, started this company called Conservation Blueprint. And that's really what we specialize in. So
Okay.
get to wear many, many hats, but the simple one is wildlife biologist. But in this case, it really is about vegetation establishment and management for things that impact positively water quality, soil health, pollinator health, grassland songbirds, food sustainability issues. Pollinator health and habitat, I describe it, Mike, as a unique glue that can connect every single one of those issues. And that is a great, great story because almost anybody that you meet, whether you're at the grocery store or the Rotary Club meeting or whatever, is going to have one of those issues I just mentioned. That's going to be their deal.
Right. That's a
Not
good point.
everybody in the world is a beekeeper or it gets excited about bees other than they're afraid of getting stung. But somebody that you meet is going to be passionate about water quality, soil health, food sustainability, monarch butterflies, honeybees, native bees, grassland songbirds, and on and on and on and on and on.
Right. And, and that ultimately describes the ecosystem that we pretty much rely on as humans, not only for well, I guess we've got agriculture now, which we could have a conversation all about that and kind of its impact. But from a natural standpoint, those things are very important.
Yeah. Yep. There's a reason why the environment and nature is called a web.
Yes.
Really good, a really
Yes.
good
Yes.
reason because
Right.
it's all
And
connected.
it's even good for the spiders.
Yes. There you go. There you go.
Well, very good. And you are down in Nebraska, correct?
Yep. I'm chatting with you today from central Nebraska. So, right outside my office window is a gorgeous looking native prairie and something that we get to enjoy all the time.
Cool. So at Conservation Blueprint, like what does your day-to-day look like? Who are your customers? Who do you serve
Mhm.
geographically? Are you just around Nebraska area?
Yeah, so we kind of have two silos in this organization. Silo number one is we're a local ecotype wildflower seed business. So some of those really hard to find rare wildflower species, we go out and actually collect the seed because we have a lot of high quality native grasslands in this geography, and then make those available to restore in a wider audience. That aspect of things works across the whole country. The silo number two is, and I did not see silo number 2 when we started Conservation Blueprint in 2017, but as the interest and enthusiasm about renewable energy has grown in the country and in the world, particularly solar energy, there's a significant increase in the number of solar energy projects going in the country. And many of those projects have at its core a desire to be producing multiple benefits, not just the renewable energy, but other multiple benefits. And it's not at all uncommon for one of those goals to be to impact pollinator health and habitat. That's where the Conservation Blueprint phone or email rings or pings, and we kind of become involved in that. And one of our roles is to design seed mixtures that will work on solar energy projects that meet all the objectives of the project, and one of those being pollinator health and habitat benefits. So for somebody that is at their core very interested in pollinator health and habitat, this is a humongous opportunity that's out there for beekeepers.
So before, I think we could probably talk about that. Sounds like we could talk about that solar fields thing at length.
Yeah.
In regards to the Ecoseeds, or at least that's what I wrote down. You guys go out and physically collect the seeds?
Yeah. And it's almost always, Mike, it's hand collected. Okay.
Oh boy.
So many of these, like right now that you and I are talking in early June. So right now we are just starting to collect the local ecotype seeds that we start for this year. And these are almost always plants that are like very small, subtle, and you have to really, number one, know where they are. You identify them while they're blooming, you record areas where you're going to go back and harvest. And it's literally hand harvesting and picking some of those things. So
wow.
Some people listening to our conversation right now are kind of like, that guy's a wacko. But for me personally, these are species that are incredibly valuable. You know, think about your honeybee resources and what is available for them in the month of April and May. Slim pickings.
Yeah.
You know,
everyone will point to dandelions.
Yeah.
Okay. But not so prairie-esque.
Right.
Well,
so
maybe they
hard
are,
to
but,
come by.
But you know what I mean.
So we're very motivated to identify, collect, and then have those things that are so incredibly valuable but hard to come by actually available. So there are some species that we have that I'm pretty confident we might be the only place in the nation where you could get them.
Oh, really?
So that's just, it's just, we have a desire to actually have those available, not to say, hey, we're the only place you can get it. It's just, that's how hard they are to come by.
Right. Well, and I've got, we talked a few weeks ago, and we've got here just at my house, we've got about 2 acres that property owner before us, 20, 30 years ago planted native flowers. And I was trying to keep track for a while of what was popping, when it was, and its color. And I think I started that last year. And I mean, it starts, and I would imagine this is pretty similar to a well laid out prairie, is it starts almost right after the dandelions are done in the spring. And it's almost weekly. There's a new flower flowering. So I just walk through there, take a picture, and I'd use Google Glass actually, or not Google Glass, but Google Lens. And it did a pretty good job of taking a picture and identifying the plant for me. But yeah, some of them are super down low, some of them are really high and obvious, and other ones are very much not obvious.
Yeah.
And I could only imagine picking.
And the stuff that is the earliest is usually kind of the most fragile, nondescript. I need a little elbow room to make it in the world. They're hard to come. That's why they're hard to come by, because that's kind of their lifestyle.
Right.
And then later in the year, things tend to just get bigger and taller and more robust and that sort of thing. So tip of the hat to whomever put your project in all those years ago. it sounds like they used a nice, widely diverse seed mixture that offered resources from the beginning of the year all the way to the end of the year. And that's exactly what we want to be providing, whether we're talking about honeybees or native bees or whatever. Floral resources throughout the entirety of the growing season.
One of the things I noticed was, my honeybees typically don't, I rarely see a honeybee on my native flowers. I always see
Yep.
bumblebees. Some of them are bumblebee, are accessible only from bumblebees, from my understanding, is that they're that strong enough to, open a petal up and get
Yep.
within the flower. And then obviously all the small flowers, like I've got on my list here, I think the first one that I ever noticed coming up is I have down as Jacob's Ladder.
Mm-hmm.
And I've never seen a honeybee on that. It's just, if I remember right, it's just a tiny, tiny little flower.
Yep.
And worked really well for our native bees, which, there's a conversation going on right now, kind of in the, if you're going to call it the underworld of beekeeping, that urban beekeeping in, the concrete jungle of our cities can be kind of somewhat detrimental to native bees. And, I'm not fully convinced, mainly I live in an area that has so much resource that I never see the ability for native being out competed by the honeybees.
Mm-hmm.
But I could see possibly where that could be some concern. And so the other thing that you and I chatted about was like, you've got this, I'll quote unquote pure flower mixture of the past versus, potentially what would be a good blend for today, which would include some things that are geared more towards honeybees. And I know you've talked about, I don't know if you want to talk about it or not, but I know that you've run into a little bit of resistance when you start having those conversations.
Yeah. So the last 1 minute, you just outlined 3 different podcasts that we could have.
It's true. It's true. And maybe we should, maybe we should.
I mean, there's a great story about why you don't see honeybees on your planting. Would love to chat about that. We talked about the competition issue. And then your last part of it was the mechanics of how you design a seed mixture. I'm going to just offer a thought about the competition issue. And that is that one of the philosophies that we take is that a rising tide floats all boats.
Right.
The more habitat we have, the better the habitat we have, the more it addresses that competition issue. Towards that point, Mike, in the 1940s, we had roughly double the number of hives that we have in the country today. We didn't hear conversations about competition and seed problems. Maybe we weren't studying it really intricately, but there were not problems with rusty patch bumblebee populations and all of that kind of stuff. What was the primary difference? The rising tide analogy. There was way more habitat, forage on the landscape so that both things could coexist with each other. So the rising tide floats all boats. And when we get an acre of habitat, which you would probably call forage, we need to make it the best it can be. That's clearly the number one thing that we can do. So one of the things that Conservation Blueprint does towards that end, and here was the last part of the conversation about the seed mixture design. When we're working on a solar energy project or a private landowner project or a corporate campus, any kind of a project that we're doing, number one, obviously we listen to what the objectives are of the project, but almost invariably we take a 2 seed mixture design approach. Okay. One of the seed mixtures that we design, we often call a honeybee seed mixture, and one we refer to as a monarch butterfly mixture. What that means is the honeybee mixture is designed to establish very, very quickly within just a month or two. And it very often contains clover species that honeybees hugely benefit from. Native bees and butterflies as well, but certainly honeybees seek that out and enjoy it quite a bit. The monarch butterfly mix is the more traditional kind of pollinator seed mixture, all native species. We kind of have a philosophy that there shall be no less than 40 wildflower species in every seed mixture, could be
Okay.
up to 65, 70. And that seed mixture establishes much slower than the honeybee mix. We often describe it as in year 1, it sleeps, in year 2, it creeps, and in year 3, it leaps. Okay.
Yes.
Slower establishment.
Right.
Pollinator species use and benefit from both seed mixtures, but because of how they're designed, they function and establish very differently. When we take that 2 seed mixture approach, whether it's in a solar energy project where one of them has to grow very low to the ground and the other one can be around the outside of the project and can be as tall as it wants, or on a private landowner project, we plant the monarch butterfly mixture in the middle of the field and the honeybee mixture around the outside of it. And then like a castle with a moat around it, we use the honeybee mix as a green fire break so that we can more safely burn the monarch butterfly,
Oh,
the
that makes sense.
wildflower mix in the middle. Those are some of the solutions that we have to chat about some of those different issues that you brought up.
So I feel like you just opened up a ton of questions for me.
We're going to have a podcast series, Mike.
Yes, we are. Yes, we are. And so I guess the first thought when you're talking about this target or this zones within an area that you have these different seed mixes, is there over time, do you get kind of some merging between those, or do they primarily kind of hold where you've initially put them?
It depends, and it
Of
depends
course,
on
of
all
course it
kinds of
does.
things. And Mike, the most important part of any habitat project that we do is you have a conversation.
Yeah.
And for my role, you listen, you ask questions, you listen carefully to hear what their objectives are, what are their long-term objectives. Because for me, the worst scenario that you can have is we're 4 or 5 years into a project and we're standing on the side of it and somebody's like, this isn't quite what I thought it was going to look like. That time, that 4 or 5 years is the most precious thing that we have. So we want to make sure and listen very closely, get the site prep correctly done, and all of those sorts of things. When that is done, plus coupling that with future management, things can kind of stay in their home. There's nothing that happens where you plant it, walk away from it, and it's always like,
Right.
great deal. You
Right.
need to do a little bit of management every year. If those activities occur, you can kind of keep everybody in their happy home.
Okay. And I know burning is real critical. Well, maybe I shouldn't say that. I've heard burning is critical on native prairie flowers. But I've never really drilled into nor asked the question, what does the fire do
Mhm.
for the prairie?
Yeah, so there's multiple benefits. Benefit number one is that it may be the most cost-effective management tool you can do. Doesn't take much to throw fire on the ground as long as things are, it's not just dumping fire on
Of
the ground.
course.
It's a prescribed activity and that sort of thing, but it's very cost effective, number one. Number two, you clean the palette, okay? That's important for your management going forward. If you wanted to do some sort of an herbicide application, you've now cleaned the palette and where you have new growth coming back that you can manage. An example might be if I felt like a cool season grass like smooth brome or something like that was beginning to take over my pollinator planting, okay, I could do a prescribed burn, clean the palette, and then when the smooth brome is 6, 7, 8 inches tall, apply an herbicide application that only impacts grass. Okay.
Got it.
And then your wildflowers come back with abundance and that sort of thing. The other advantages are that it returns nutrients back to the soil. If you're doing a spring prescribed burn and you just say you did a burn in March or April and you've turned that soil black, it heats up quicker than the surrounding landscape because it's black. You get spring rain on it, things really start happening.
That makes
There,
sense.
some of the other benefits are there are seeds that need that kind of stimulation from heat and or smoke and things like that to be able to germinate. So there's just a number of benefits. For me, we have areas outside the office here that we burn every single year. And that also removes or significantly lowers the fire danger for the rest of the year. Because we've burned it and taken away all that residual vegetation from the year before.
So now you've got green growth now and
yes,
nothing.
So there was, I think I just gave you like about 7 or 8 benefits right there.
For sure.
Those are, the list is longer than that, but those are some really good examples of why prescribed fire is such a great tool.
So this might be maybe a good segue into the solar aspect of it. When you're dealing with obstacles within those burns, like solar panels is one example.
Yep.
How do you what's the management strategy around burning and preventing areas from being damaged?
Yeah, it's very challenging. So now we're just talking about solar, and most of what Conservation Blueprint works on is what we refer to as grid scale solar. So just think of that as like 300 acres to 3,000 acres in size, big stuff.
Which is great area for habitat.
Yeah, it can be. It can be. Yep. So we're never going to use prescribed fire. That's not going to happen. We're not going to use cattle in there. We're not going to use goats. And I could go into all the reasons why we don't. I think people will kind of be able to figure them out. Those are some of the best management tools that we might have. We're not going to go in livestock or prescribed fire or mechanical disturbance like with a disc. None of those things are going to happen. We're not going to be dragging a disc down rows next to panels and things like that. So really, here's what you're left with: mowing, herbicide application, or a combination of both, and possibly, I say possibly because there's challenges to it, sheep grazing. Okay, that's it. So just like when I said, if we have to select plants that don't grow taller than a certain height, and that removes lots of the options, well, we just removed some of the best options for management. So that all has to go into how we're designing the recipe for a seed mixture. So most solar energy projects are a 30-year lease agreement on private land, where the landowner is being given an annual rental payment for that. Well, we have to think about how's that going to function for 30 years. So those are all things that go into the recipe, and it's not easy. There is an art and a science to it. And for anybody that says, oh, well, here's a great pollinator seed mixture. Well, probably is a great pollinator seed mixture, but that doesn't mean it's going to work on a solar energy project.
Right. Well, and
we have to really think about that and balance it.
And do you see a difference in your ability to go to your tool chest, types of seeds, in a project where you're involved from the beginning versus more of an afterthought?
Oh yeah, very much so.
What from just a general idea, you had mentioned, I think earlier, 18 inches seems typical, would going to 3 foot or, 4 feet off the ground, does that provide you 70% more or?
Oh yeah. So they're both solar energy projects, but that's where the similarities end. From a vegetation management standpoint, they're apples and oranges, those two examples that you just said.
Okay.
But Mike, think about, let's just make up a project. It's 2,000 acres in size. And the cost difference just of the steel pilings to have the lower panel height at 24 inches versus 36 or 48 inches off of the ground is millions and millions and millions of dollars. And that doesn't even take into effect the higher you have the panel, that then you have to, perhaps you would have to have a lift system to take the people when they are doing repairs or updates to it, to lift them up even higher off of the ground. It's just, it's a very, very specific increase in cost for both the construction and the management of a project. So there's a reason why lower panel heights are closer to the ground.
Okay. Do you ever see it where you get involved early and it triggers a higher panel design?
No, the from my perspective, the primary benefits of being described or being involved in the project early on is being able to think about all of those different objectives and to make sure that every box is being checked along the process. If we become involved in a project a little bit after the train is kind of pulled out of the station, well, then sometimes site prep hasn't been done correctly or something like that, or fully. And those always come back to produce problems for us down the line.
Okay. All right. So I guess, I mean, like you say, I mean, I just feel like everything we kind of branch off to, we could go into about an hour long conversation.
Well, just so Mike, let me, if we're gonna leave solar, let me leave
Oh,
one
I'm not
thought
leaving solar
for,
yet.
okay. But if, you know, I just, here's my passion, Mike. I have a lot of great friends that are commercial beekeepers, salt of the earth, greatest people in the world. And some of them are third, fourth, fifth generation beekeepers. And I think about how that industry has changed and the dangers that industry is in terms of not being sustainable. 40% annual hive losses is not 45, 50. It's not sustainable.
No, I know. I
It's
know last year.
not sustainable.
Right. So my last episode, I had a gentleman on named Corey Stevens. He's out of Missouri. And for anyone that hasn't listened to that podcast, I suggest listening to it. But VSH and treatment-free people have gotten kind of a bad rap as the kind of the culprit that's creating some of these issues. But the more you drill down on it, it's coming down to a fundamental issue with the bees' genetics. And one of the things that we ran through was there's a online form. It's beinformedpartnership.org.
Mm-hmm.
And you've heard of it?
Yeah. Yep. You bet.
Yeah. And so you can go state by state on annual losses and see where it's at. And last year was, I think it averaged 60%. And that's just,
not sustainable.
No, not at all. And something has to change. And we kind of have an idea what it is. And there's some major pillars in there. One of them being genetics. So, and by genetics, I mean they're able to survive winter as well as pests. The other, habitat, which is why we're talking, right? And I'm 42 years old, and I've not been on this planet as long as some other people. And just even in those 20 years that I've been paying attention, I've seen windrows because I'm a hunter as well. And, I noticed deer populations going down. I noticed grouse populations going down. And the question is why? And to me, at least in my area, so I'm in the upper Midwest, which you're pretty much there as well. We're real close to the Twin Cities area. And so we're right kind of on the outskirts in Wisconsin of industrialized agriculture. And we've taken windrows that were 30 feet wide with trees piled on top of trees and just beautiful habitat for birds to survive. They're gone. And what else grew in those windrows? Flowers and pollinator habitat. Well, now the farmer's putting a row of corn damn near on the property line, and so is the farmer next to him, and so
Yeah.
that habitat has gone. And so I don't really remember why I started on that rant, but
Well, this is the example where when we said the rising tide floats all boats.
right,
Well, what you're describing is a very, very low tide. And that's
exactly,
and
right,
that's where we end up in problems with competition, where bees become increasingly susceptible to pesticides, parasites, disease, and that sort of thing. Whether the things that we either can't control or are having a really hard time controlling. News flash to your listeners, it's really hard to control an insect that's attached to an insect,
right,
you know.
right. It is, yeah.
Pretty
It's a little
challenging.
teeny window of efficacy there.
So this is where I get so excited about the solar industry, because we have the opportunity to have highly nutritious forage on chunks of ground that are 300 acres to 3,000 acres in size
Massive impacts.
when designed correctly, and I'm a huge fan of the University of Minnesota Bee Lab and Dr. Marla Spivak. And, her research has clearly shown that when you have access to highly nutritious forage, you have better opportunities for your bees to withstand the other death of 1,000 paper cuts that
Right.
they have to endure. So this is where I'm just so incredibly excited and energized about the solar industry, because we have the opportunity to do something meaningful, good, and impactful, not just for
Right.
honeybees, but native bees, grassland songbirds, soil quality, water quality, food sustainability, renewable energy, all of the things
Right.
that really we all kind of care about.
Well, and a lot of that, the agriculture that I described here a few minutes ago, I mean, that ultimately is a desert for pollinators.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you look
Well,
at it,
you're.
it's green, it's beautiful,
Mm-hmm.
but even the ditches in most of these cases are mowed right
Mm-hmm.
down to the, 3-4 inches, which provides the bees nothing. So it might be green and it might look like it's great habitat, or you're in an area that could support them. But in reality, the way the bees may see it, it very well may be a absolute desert for nectar for
Right.
them.
So
And
that then also goes back to the point that we made early on in this conversation of when we get an acre of habitat, it
has to be
has
awesome.
to be the best it can be. We cannot afford to have something out there that's kind of, it's better than a
Right.
guy
I
with a
threw my
tractor.
clay ball out in the field.
Yeah, there you go.
Well, and what makes me excited about you're talking about these solar fields is, you're taking, 300 acres, 3,000 acres, whatever that project is, and you're taking a desert and completely 180ing the nectar
Mhm.
resources for local pollinators, whether even that's hummingbirds, hummingbirds,
Yeah.
butterflies, bees of all sorts.
Yep.
So,
And so we have to design that final vegetative cover to clearly think about what the objectives are of the solar project. That's numero uno. We have to be generating safe, reliable, renewable energy on the project, but we can do that and meet all kinds of great environmental multiple benefits. It can be done, just has to be approached very thoughtfully.
right. And one of the conversations I've heard from other people, you and I briefly touched on it, was the difference between, going hardcore native versus a blend that
Mhm.
provides what everything need, well, not everything, but what could provide more forage for more things versus,
Mhm.
being very specific. And you and I both kind of share the same phrases, don't let perfect be the enemy of the good. And
Yeah.
maybe you could talk a little bit about some of your experience and run-ins, and maybe some headbutting you've done in the
Mhm.
past with
Yeah.
projects like
So
that.
I think Conservation Blueprint has worked on a number of really cool solar projects where there have been unintended negative consequences, and they're almost solely related to when the permitting language or the entity that kind of controls and approves what can be planted on it wants to hold the project to prairie restoration standards. Okay. Disclaimer number one. Remember silo number one, local eco type seeds and all that kind of stuff. I'm a prairie fairy. Love it.
You need a shirt. Prairie fairy.
No, that's not going to happen, Mike.
I'm going to make one. The link's below.
But I'm a prairie guy. Love it. Care about it passionately. A solar energy project is not a prairie restoration project for multiple reasons. And it all goes back to all these other objectives that solar energy project has to have. That does not mean that we can't do all kinds of great things on that solar energy project that produce multiple benefits, pollinator health and habitat being one of them. And that's just what absolutely drives me. But I've seen goals for prairie restoration just take a project and turn it sideways from the unintended consequences. And literally, I can tell you about a project that went from a seed mixture that cost $200 an acre, and this was on thousands and thousands of acres of a solar project. Because of the requirement that it had to follow prairie restoration standards, it became a seed mixture that cost $1,860 an acre. So do the math on that. The cost difference, 2,000 acre project went from $200 an acre to 1,860. And some of the species in their seed mixture weren't even commercially available enough to plant 2,000 acres. Over the course of a year and a half, that project went all the way around in the circle, and it finally landed back with the first seed mixture that was proposed for the project. That was the $200 an acre seed mixture that provides great pollinator benefits, but wasn't held to that prairie restoration standard.
So where, I mean, I'm not asking you to call out any specific agency or state, but are you seeing it state, county, agency-based levels? I mean, what levels are you, is it, or is it everything?
All of that.
It
all
is,
of
really.
That. And you know, Mike, if you think about it, it's really easy to see how it happens.
Yeah.
Who would not sit there and if somebody said, well, we need to make sure that, you know, this is one, all native vegetation. We don't want any introduced plant species.
Well,
but Mike, who wouldn't sit there and say, well, yeah, that sounds right. And almost invariably, the people that are saying that don't understand that the hay fields that they would drive by in agriculture, alfalfa, sweet clover, any of the clovers that are out there are all an introduced plant species. They're used routinely in agriculture, and you couldn't drive, 15 miles in the country without going by one of those fields. They don't understand that they just took out a whole suite of plant species that tolerate mowing, are commercially available, cost effective, established quickly, tremendous pollinator value, all of those.
And I feel like sometimes like you were explaining it this way, but I feel like native sometimes gets a bit over glorified. You look back in 1940s, our area, we're very hilly, and they brought in black locusts to help prevent. There's invasive as well as not native, right? But there's some significant benefits to it. It's 90% of the wood we burn in the wintertime, and it's a great heat source, and so it's I'm not suggesting that non-native should be thrown everywhere and that invasives shouldn't be taken seriously. I'm not saying that whatsoever. However, I think though sometimes we push things into camps and we treat the camp a certain way, not necessarily the individual item.
Yep.
And
Two thoughts on that. One is, I believe that we have to take a step back and look at what all the objectives are, and don't just go into the camp, as you referred to it. Really think about what the objectives are. And again, we're going to say this 2 more times on the podcast. Don't let the pursuit of perfect become the enemy of doing something good. That's thought number one. Thought number two is, it gives me no pleasure to say this, but particularly in this thing called the pollinator world, there tends to be way too many groups and individuals that like to draw lines in the sand
Right.
and say, we're good, you're bad. You see it in the beekeeping world all the time.
Oh yeah, for sure.
Honeybees are not native. They're, I don't care about honeybees, whatever. People draw lines in the sand. And throughout my career, I'm a lumper, not a splitter. My career has been built on coming up with collaborative efforts and pulling people together to do things. So I'm a lumper, not a splitter. And towards that end, I believe absolutely that if we want to come up with significant pollinator health and habitat benefits for beekeepers, commercial beekeeping, and honeybees, we have to find a way to work with agriculture and with agricultural industry, chemical companies, that sort of thing. We have to find ways to work together.
Right.
One of the phrases that we use in the monarch butterfly world is that for the solution, we have to have all hands on deck. I apply that to lots of different things in the beekeeping world as well. And we don't have the opportunity with 40, 50, 60% annual losses and the sustainability of the industry at a juncture where it may not be sustainable. We don't have the luxury of drawing lines in the sand and say, you're bad, you have to stay over there.
So
We
how do
have to
you
find ways to come together.
so how do you bring people together that are um one of the avenues I guess I could see would be someone saying it's not native, and then the conversation may go, but it helps the pollinators, and then the very next argument is, but those honeybees are not native. How do you rally those troops to
Mhm.
kind of bend a little bit? Is it just saying, you're incorporating some native prairie elements, or explain kind of, if you run into that
Sure.
challenge, how do you overcome that?
Well, whether you're talking politics or pollinator habitat in our society today, there are people that are entrenched that you will not move no matter what. But the majority of the people out there, if they watched this podcast and heard the conversations, the great conversations that we're having about, we use the analogy of the rising tide floating all boats. Don't let pursuit of perfect become the enemy of something good. Coming up with really viable solutions that move the needle, Mike. Most people are going to hear that conversation, think about it, and be, yeah, okay, I get it. One of the really bright spots on the horizon, I think, is when you look at any study about pollinator health and habitat that asks the public about it. Every one of those studies shows, one, that the public has a very heightened level of concern, and that number two, the public is willing to spend some money to do something. And it's not in the survey, but my personal observation, number three, is people want to do something. They don't know how and where to be able to do something to make a difference.
Okay. And that,
Future podcast, we'll probably chat about a nonprofit that we support that's called the Bee and Butterfly Habitat Fund. That is one of the great solutions that is absolutely moving the needle and making a difference. And any podcast listener that has somebody coming up with a birthday, an anniversary, Mother's Day, Father's Day, Christmas, whatever, they have this thing called Gifts That Grow. Okay. And in that deal, you make $100 contribution or whatever dollar amount. But for $100, you have 1/2 acre of pollinator habitat that is established, and you get a e-certificate that is customized for that person that you're giving to them for their birthday or the anniversary or Mother's Day. That is how we can move the needle and make a difference.
Well, and one of the things that I think honeybees represent kind of that pollination, or I don't maybe know necessarily how to phrase that. They represent, they're the face of habitat. And I get a little concerned when we start talking about, not you and I, but just industry wise about like urban beekeeping, how it's bad. I'm yet to see any kind of real evidence showing that the honeybees actually taking nectar from a native bee, which would be interesting to see. However, I don't really see people run around championing the bumblebee or championing carpenter bees. I see people run around championing honeybees. And what does that action, or what does that championing represent? It represents action, which is planting, the clay balls of seeds or an acre or two of pollinator, which helps them all. And so when we start, once again, perfect being the enemy of the good, we maybe lose traction or we lose some of the traction that we're already gaining by championing the honeybee. And so when it comes to that bee and butterfly habitat fund, which we will talk about in the future, is it native bees or honeybees or mixture, or what does that look like?
So they take that 2-seed mixture approach that I referenced earlier in our conversation.
Okay.
So every project that's established has that component that establishes quickly. It's called a honeybee mix that has clovers in it. And then the more slowly establishing, the sleep, creep, leap approach of that, a 100% all native wildflower mix with a minimum of 40 species in it. And they take that approach. And when we transition to that podcast in the future, one of the exciting things that I'll be able to tell you about is the research that's being done on those seed mixtures and that approach. And it has significant increased pollinator benefits and is really moving the needle. So I'll be really excited to share that information with you, because that is how we're going to make a difference. When we get an acre of habitat, we have to make it the best it can be. And the good news is, Mike, if there ever was an example of if you build it, they'll come, pollinator habitat's the deal.
For sure.
It's amazing. Towards that end, one small story with the Bee and Butterfly Habitat Fund. One of the many research projects that are looking at their seed mixtures is in southwestern Minnesota, not too far from where you're at. And the University of Minnesota is conducting the study. And on those seed mixtures designed by the Bee and Butterfly Habitat Fund, they now have recorded 3 new Minnesota bee records. What that means is a bee species never before ever anywhere identified as occurring in the state of Minnesota have been identified and found on these projects.
That's cool.
If you build it, they will come.
Right.
And when we get an acre of habitat, let's make it the best it can be. And those are some of the results. That's pretty exciting stuff.
That's very exciting. So for someone that's wanting to do something, and maybe we'll get more into it when we have you on again for that Bee and Butterfly Habitat Fund. If someone wants to do something right now, what would you suggest for someone that's, let's break it down to 3 things: a small plot, and maybe I'll have you describe what you would consider a small plot, medium, and large. What can someone do now? What could they take away from this?
if you remember the analogy I gave you where I said the worst case scenario that could ever happen on a project is when we're 4 or 5 years into it and somebody's standing there and they're like, this
Yeah.
doesn't look like what I thought it was going to look like.
Yeah.
The most important thing you can do is put 1 full year into site preparation. Any corner that you cut in site preparation, because it's like, I don't want to wait a year, I want to plant it
Right.
now. I want to see flowers and that kind of stuff, comes back to haunt you. Once the seeds are planted, your options to prepare a site and to manage what's going to happen on there become very limited. So almost invariably, we instruct somebody to put 1 full growing season into site preparation.
So if someone wanted to do something right now, what should they do for site prep
Yep.
for next
So
year?
I'm going to tell you what we affectionately call the gold plan. And it's called the gold plan because it is the bomb. It's the #1 best results that you'll see in year 1, in year 5, in year 10. Great results. Most people that tend to come to us with something that is currently in grass. Okay. The back pasture, part of my backyard, used to be in CRP, whatever. That is the most challenging platform to work with. Very, very hard. You have all the competition that you see above the ground, but then below the ground, you have all kinds of competition as well, where the grass root system has filled up the soil horizon. It's all competition. The gold plan that you could still do this year, right now, is to go out and take that area, remove the vegetative cover on it, and plant it to soybeans for 1 full growing season.
So how would you
Treat it
remove
just
the
like,
grass? What would you recommend for doing that?
yeah. So I would go out there and I would hay it or mow it or whatever, or a prescribed fire, and then spray it to kill the grass, and then no-till the soybeans right into that. Okay. Here's your advantages. Treat it just like conventional agriculture. You fully terminate the grass, both above ground and below ground. The soybeans will naturally produce nitrogen that will be in your soil. That'll give your new planting a nice little boost. And then #3, you have a great seed bed to plant into that fall, like in November. So that's called the gold plan for a reason, because the results that we get are far, far superior doing that than anything else. Now, there's lots of areas where somebody's going to say, that's not going to work. I can't do that for reason A, B, or C. There are other things you can do. Just know that's the best. Okay.
So if let's say someone just wanted to take a small area and they were against spraying for whatever reason,
Yep.
what would be your recommendation for a smaller area? Like, would tarping it make sense, or?
So, yep. So small is a relative term, but when you say small, I envision something that we could solarize. Okay. And you basically referenced it when you said tarping it or putting black plastic over it or something like that.
You call that solarizing it.
Yep. You're killing the existing vegetation. Okay. So for people that are like, no, I cannot bring myself to spray. I think I'm going to hurt my bees, or I watch late night TV and I think if I spray glyphosate, somebody will be born having 2 heads or something like that, So those people, if it's a small thing, you can solarize it like that. Just know that is incredibly detrimental to soil health. So on one hand, you're like, I won't spray because of how bad it is for all these other things. And the only real solution out there is to do something that is just terrible.
Well, I suppose it bakes the soil, which kills all those microorganisms.
Exactly.
I never thought of that.
Yeah. So putting tarps and black plastic out on something that's like an acre in size is not very realistic.
Right.
So when you said small, I went to that. The other options. So say, I do have something that's 2 acres. I can't solarize it. It's too big. I'm not going to use chemical. Your only other option is really to use mechanical disturbance like tillage.
Yeah.
Also detrimental to soil health and guaranteed to introduce all kinds of invasive,
Yeah, I have a story on
noxious
that.
plant species that, somebody would say, oh, there's no thistle here. This has always
Right.
been a pasture.
Right.
You go out and scratch the ground
Yeah,
and
you
that
will have
stuff will
thistle
show up.
everywhere. Yeah, and I shared my story with you a couple weeks ago. Was I made a deer plot, and I was very anti-chemical, and still only like to use it when I absolutely have to.
Mhm.
And the people that did our prairie here, which is we've done nothing to, they sprayed it with Roundup the whole hillside, 2 to 3 acres, and it has performed beautifully going that route. And the guy that helped them do it was a sustainability director at a campus and very anti-chemical, but he knew that that was the path that they needed to do it. But my story is I'm making this food plot. It's about 2 acres, tilled it up, tilled it, sprayed my seeds. And it, first year was fine. The deer were showing up. Next year, I did not get out there to put my seeds in there. I had thistles that were 10 feet tall and more Murdoch or burdock. Is it burdock? Burdock,
Well,
right?
there's burdock and mullein and
So burdock.
kochia
I had burdock and thistles everywhere, which was horrible. I mean, nothing. I mean, I guess maybe you could argue the thistles were good for the bumblebees.
Yeah. But many of those plant species are biennials. So you just didn't probably notice it very much in year one, but it was happening.
Oh, I'm sure.
There's this really amazing study out of Michigan. I'm gonna describe it very loosely, but this scientist, took soil and put it in these glass orbs and sealed it up. And this past year, which was 127 years after he put the soil in this thing, every decade or so, they pull some soil out and they see if there's anything in there that will germinate and grow. 127 years later, there were weed species in there that still germinated and grew.
No kidding. Wow.
So if somebody thinks, well, I'll just go out there and I'll disc it for a couple of years. No. So from my perspective, as a wildlife biologist, if you took herbicide application, particularly glyphosate, out of my toolbox, I would struggle to produce the kind of habitat that we produce.
That's good to know. I mean, you use the right tool for the right job. And I mean, if someone will have to make their own decision, but you described what is the best chance for a good product in the end.
And so it all depends on what their objectives are. And that's why earlier on in our conversation, I said the most important thing is I listen very carefully, ask questions and listen, and if somebody is like, nope, there shall be no chemicals that are sprayed on this project. Okay, I get it. That tells me these tools are no longer in my toolbox, and here's what I'm left with. And as a wildlife biologist, you just hope that at the end of the day, when you open your toolbox, you have more than a rusty screwdriver and a roll of duct tape.
Right. Which you might be able to do a lot with.
You can in the right conditions.
Right. So of that, small plot that maybe someone's hopefully starting to work on, or at least formulating their plan for their property in their mind now, what would be their next steps? Would it be reaching out to you guys and saying, hey, this is what I'm looking at, and then providing a seed mix? Or if that is the case, what kind of seeds are you starting to think of for someone that wants to have what ideal pollinator mix for butterflies and for honeybees and native bees?
So Conservation Blueprint helped the Bee and Butterfly Habitat Fund develop this guide, free to anybody that wants it. It's called a Pollinator Habitat Establishment and Management Guide. And it's designed to take you through step by step by step by step through the process of site preparation, seed mixture design, all of that kind of stuff. So I'm just going to assume that throughout the course of this podcast, I'm going to supply you with photos and links and all that kind of stuff. And you'll, in the editorial magic, kind of slip those things in at the correct moment in time. And so we will have a link to that. And that would be the next step that I would tell somebody to go to.
Okay.
Then you can apply for free seed. Every application has a habitat coordinator that connects with them to provide one-on-one technical guidance. It's not no deal would ever work where it was just here's your bags of free seed, go get it. Good luck.
Yeah, I know a couple of those people, and it's bare grass right now.
Yeah. So it's a lot more guidance and that sort of thing, and it has to be that way, Mike, because this is really, really important.
Yes,
I
would agree.
We have to be successful at this. When we get an acre of habitat, it has to be the best it can be. We can ill afford to have something that's kind of, like somebody handing you a glass of hot water on a really hot day when you're dying of thirst and saying, here's your glass of water.
Here's your water. Yeah. Well, and we're not going to change our agricultural situation and human development or human, human development. And so like you say, we have to take what we have and convert it into something really, really good.
Yeah.
And hopefully continue to do that.
Yeah. And there's a lot of bright spots out there, but one of them is for the people that are interested in this, that's what they want too. They want it to be the best of the best of the best. And even the commercial beekeepers that we work with are like, yeah, I want it to benefit all these species. I want it to benefit water quality, soil health, native bees, butterflies, grassland songbirds. I want it to do all of that. And when you explain to people, you can do all of those things and benefit your honeybees as well. That's what everybody wants. Right. So that's very, very encouraging. Most conversations with people start out with, well, I tried this once before and it didn't turn out very well, or this is what I want to do, but I don't know exactly how to do it. If you have somebody that can tell me what to do, I'll do exactly what it is you say. That's really encouraging stuff. So we just need to get the word out more about how to do those sorts of things.
Okay.
And that's what we're here for.
Well, great. I think that's probably a good spot to stop. And, I'll encourage people to reach out to you and the Bee and Butterfly Habitat Fund with the links below or in the show notes. And, maybe we'll get something scheduled here to start talking about the Bee and Butterfly Habitat Fund exclusively.
Yeah. Well, we only outlined about 6 or 7 different podcast episodes we could have today.
And solar I'm happy to entertain those. Yes.
And I still want to come back to sometime explaining to you why you don't see your honeybees out much in that one project, but that's another podcast.
Oh, there it is. You left us in suspense. Very good. Yes, right. Very good. Make a note so you do cover that next time.
All right.
Well, awesome. Well, thank you again, Peter, and we will definitely stay in touch and get the next 7 episodes scheduled.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Mike. I've enjoyed it. This is a great topic that we'll be happy to help promote and get out to more listeners as well.
Awesome. Well, thank you.
All right. Have a great day, everybody.
There was nothing left to say. How to get up, walk away, know when to hold, know when to fold.